Welcome, Tarik Podcast listeners. Our first two episodes of this Adwa series focused more on the events. This episode will do so as well, while being more discussion based. We hope you enjoy it. There are a lot of interesting questions to follow the podcast. Starting off, what factors do you think led to the Ethiopian victory?
All right. So there's a lot of things that I think that we can discuss. For instance, now we went into this in depth, like in the podcast. The way the Ethiopians purposefully misinformed the Italians of their intent and the conditions of their armies was definitely a massive factor, like a massive deciding factor. So, the major vassals like Nugus Tekla Hamanot of Gojam, Ras Mikhail of Wello, etc., would like send letters to the Italians, of course, as they were instructed by Milik, giving the Italians the idea that they would betray Ethiopia. And there were various double agents that the Italians had hired to, give information, like to get information. But of course, they were working for the Ethiopian side, especially under Rasalula. And so I think that's definitely one of the massive, deciding factors.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The misinformation campaign was vital, and you had a lot of double agents working within the Italian army, and feeding them false information, like you said. But also something that was mentioned in the podcast that we discussed in depth was how brilliant Menelik was in regards to importing firearms and making sure that Ethiopia was up to par, and in many regards actually had weapons and firepower that were more modern than what the Italians had at that time. Because, like we mentioned, the Italians were giving out hand-me-down rifles and whatnot to their Askari soldiers in particular, and the Ethiopians were they had firearms that were superior, and another thing that we have to, understand is the European sense of arrogance or superiority to Africans, and that really played a huge role in them underestimating Menelik, underestimating Ethiopians as a whole. So when they actually did come face to face, they were shocked at the military prowess of Ethiopians. And remember, Menelik's army was tried and tested. That's during that expansion process that Sammy discussed in the podcast. You have to understand that his warriors went to war, went to battle, and they seen war that the Italian army did not see. They had experience that made them truly, veterans in battle. So you add that to the fact that they had superior firepower, or firepower that was equal to the colonialists, and then you had soldiers that were trained, tried, and tested. I think the stage was set for a very decisive showdown, and it worked in Menelik's favor.
Definitely. And I really think that what another big factor was the fact that the Italians really underestimated the Ethiopian people's, their wish to defend their national integrity and their national sovereignty. Because it really, they had this, not just the Italians, but the Europeans had this view in their mind that all these African tribes and all these chiefdoms were constantly fighting with each other, and they hated each other, and there was no concept of nationhood. So they kind of they just pretty much assumed that Ethiopia, all of these different provincial region leaders and there's regions, they were going to constantly swab with each other, and they were going to side with the Italians if they tried to persuade them enough. and they really underestimated Ethiopia's long history of unifying against foreign threats, foreign aggression, and their threats. And they had tried to adapt this, this very widely used divide and conquer kind of policy that other European colonial powers tried to use in order to divide the rest up of Africa. They adopted these practices, but the fact that Ethiopia was immune to that really kind of took them by surprise. If y'all know, like in terms of the history of preceding Adwa, they tried to turn Minilik. The Italians tried to turn Minilik against the previous emperor at Johannes against them, and what that didn't work out when they were, well, it did work out sort of in a way what they perceived as it worked out, because Minilik was receiving arms because he was a rival to Johannes. So when Minilik came into power and he called them out, and he was like, you're not going to take over this country. They were like, okay, you know what, then we're going to do the same thing that we did to Johannes, and we're going to try to bribe the other regional leaders against them, just like how they tried to pit Minilik against Johannes. And there's a quote here that the Italian Prime Minister Crispi actually said to Colonel Bartieri. This is what he said, and I quote: Minilik's inexcusable behavior compels us to prepare from now on a defense plan. As we did with Minilik against Johannes, we should now encourage pretenders against Minilik. Ras Mengesha and Tigray, Mekonnen, besides personal ambitions, have serious grounds for hatred and revenge against the emperor. If Minilik disappears, the emperor could be divided into two kingdoms, one in the north and another in the south, under Italy's lofty protections. So it's clear to see that they already had these plans to divide Ethiopia and try to pit other people against each other. Like this was all a plan that they tried to premeditate, but there was no kind of thought in their mind that these regional rulers, as divided as they were, or as hostile as they were to each other over personal ambitions, they always believed that Ethiopia was greater. Ethiopia was a priority against national enemies. So that was a huge factor. And the fact that, Minilik, he was I think people have already said it like earlier in the podcast. Minilik tricked the Italians, and he made it look like these other, Ras Mengesha and Tekla Haymanot were about to betray him. He went and he sent fake letters out, pretending that they were on his side. And then comes to turn out, they pull up in the morning, and you got all these provincial leaders, and you got all these different peoples lining up stacked against them. They were about to wipe them out. And he was like, yeah, y'all thought, Ethiopia comes first at the end of the day. So this concept of national unity, things that preceded even Italy, like Italy was itself it wasn't even a unified country until 1865. There was no concept of Italian nationalism. But Ethiopia as a country, Ethiopia has existed for centuries before. And they couldn't come up with that. They could not, it was unfathomable in their minds that we had a country that we would, fight and die for. And that's something that all our ancestors did. So that's something that completely, that took them by surprise. And that was a huge factor.
Yo, man, like going off of that last point, I'm not sure if it was Crispy or someone else, like in the Italian diplomatic party. But so basically, when Minlik took power and he started taking a sort of hardline policy, and when they're on their way to Adwa, he basically said something along the lines of Johannes has not died. Minlik, the king of Shoa, is vastly different from Minlik, the king of kings. So basically, they were saying there was no difference right now in their approach to Italy. Johannes was the same exact thing as Minlik. So they vastly underestimated how far people would go to protect their national interests as well.
Facts.
Yeah.
Facts.
And actually
it just goes to prove how diplomatic Minilik was. He was well aware of their intent, and I think this is it was a key a factor in why Minilik never actually actively moved against Emperor Johannes, because like I said before, like when back when Menelik and when Johannes was emperor and Menelik was Nugus of Showa, there was a lot of hostilities between Johannes and Menelik, and the Italians thought that he was going to act on behalf of them, so they kept giving him arms, and they kept giving him arms, basically saying that we're going to give you arms if you promise to move against him. And he was like, yeah, I got you, I'm going to move against Johannes. And for 10 years, he didn't do nothing. Sorry, this man finessed the hell out of these white Italian colonial leaders. Like, people really don't understand, like, how could, like, the fact that he's not even emperor yet, and this king was out here finessing them. Like, he completely used their own weapons against them in that same battle. And that's something that's black excellence. We have to say that's black excellence. That's African excellence right there.
Yeah, I agree. And just to touch on that, the fact that Ethiopiaዊነት, that Ethiopianism that has existed not just for centuries, in my opinion, but for millennia, was evident in so many cases because the Italians tried that divide and rule conquer, and that may have succeeded in other places, but in Ethiopia it wasn't that effective because you couldn't betray your motherland. One of my favorite stories of the Battle of Adwa is of this young man. His name was Lij Abraha, and the Italians and what is today Eritrea, and I think part of Tigray as well. They sent him to Italy to become educated. At that time when they were colonizing Eritrea, when they were occupying Tigray, they sent this young boy. His name was Lij Abraha to Italy to become educated. Anyways, at the end of the battle, after the aftermath of battle, after Ethiopia had won, they allowed the Italians to come back and reclaim their dead. The soldiers that they had lost, et cetera, et cetera. Ethiopia allowed them to come back, take your soldiers as a sense of good gesture and good faith from us. Collect your dead, bury your dead. And this kid comes out of nowhere to General Aremonde, and he starts speaking in a perfect Piedmont accent. It's perfect Italian. And General Aramondi is just shocked. Like, how does this kid know Italian so well? Like, he speaks it fluently. Jesus Christ, he speaks it like with a perfect Piedmont accent. Even the Ascari that fight for us, they can barely master, workable Italian. But this kid speaks it perfectly. He was shocked, and they asked him, like, how do you know Italian so well? They realized he was that kid that they sent to Italy as a kid. But what happened is during the Battle of Adwa, this kid ended up coming back to Ethiopia and saying, I'm going to fight for my country against the Italians. So yeah, they gave me an opportunity to become educated, make something out of myself, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, Ethiopia is my country. Ethiopia is my motherland. And to me, that was one shining example of no matter what, that Ethiopianism is always going to be in your heart and your soul. And this kid ends up fighting against the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, and Menelik, as a reward for his services, makes him the chief of the village of Inticho, which is northern Ethiopia and Tigray today. And he was only 20 years old. So that was just a great example of Ethiopiaዊነት being something so powerful, where even no matter how enticing the enemy is, at the end of the day, your motherland is your motherland. You can't turn on your motherland no matter what. And that was such a good little example. It's just a funny story. So that definitely ties into the fact that misinformation campaign that Nati was talking about, and that Ethiopiaዊነት and Ethiopianism that Sammy was talking about definitely ties into that, just touches into that. There's so many examples of that, by the way. But it's just a little funny story. And Nati, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, man. Like on the Lijabra thing, was he sent by? I thought he was sent by Menelik to Italy. I didn't know that it was the Italians who sent him.
No, it was actually the Italians that sent him. When I was reading on his story, the Italians had sent him to Turin when he was 13, and he was educated there, and he ended up mastering Italian. So when he returned, though, he joined the resistance against the Italians, and he fought for Ethiopia at Adwa. And then in recognition of his services, he was made chief of Inticho. And he was only 20 years old at that time, right? And as a gesture of friendship to Italy, actually, Lij Abraha sought the release of Orico Rosario, who was an Italian prisoner from Campania. and he was under his basically his guardianship until Menelik could negotiate with the Italians to send them back. But as a gesture of friendship, he's like, you know what, you guys let me study in your country. There's no hard feelings. I'll just give you this guy back. And I thought that was just such a funny story. But yeah, it was actually the Italians that sent him out to become educated. And just to touch on that too, like I also think a major factor was Alfred Ilg, the Swiss engineer that was Menelik's, basically right hand. He was instrumental in what he was doing, and people don't understand the gravity of that. This is at a time where there was not a lot of Ethiopians in the diaspora like today. We didn't know how to speak European languages, but Alfred Ilg was traveling Europe at that time, telling Ethiopia's story in a language that Europeans could understand. So it humanized Ethiopians to the European public, and it made Europeans become vastly against Italy's aggression towards Ethiopia, a sovereign nation. And I thought that was just brilliant. Not to mention, Alfred Ilg was as an arms dealer, right? So like Sammy was talking about how Menelik was playing the Italians, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't do anything, but they were giving him guns anyways for some lip service when he didn't actually commit or do anything against Johannes. But mind you, Alfred Ilg is probably the one behind the scenes telling Menelik, yo, listen, the British hate the French. They have their rivals. Know that the Italians are going to try this divide and conquer technique because they've been doing it everywhere around Europe. You need to be smart and play them against each other. So it was amazing that Menelik actually understood the rivalries that were amongst Europeans. He understood what European public opinion would be. He understood how to politically maneuver Europeans against each other. I don't think any African monarch at that time was able to successfully do something like that. And that also, ties into the ignorance that Europeans have for Africans, especially at that time. Like, how could an African king or African monarch do something like this and play us? No way. Like, are you kidding? No, these are savages. They throw spears. No, like they're not going to be able to politically outmaneuver us, and that's exactly what happens. That's why underestimating your enemy I think could be the worst thing ever, and that's what the Italians did. That was one of the key things that was destroyed them in the end. Not to mention, Alfred Ilg didn't just go out there and give lip service. He was also an arms dealer. He literally, you thought the Italians were the only ones supplying Menelik. The French were heavily supporting Menelik, because they hated the British. And they knew that, all right, if we support Menelik, he can keep the British on hold and they won't get any more territory. So like, look into the brilliance of this. Menelik had 500,000 rifles in the field by the time Adwa started. You understand the gravity of that number? Like, that's crazy, right? Sorry, Sam, you were saying?
No, I was just wanted to say, like, he used their own policies. He used their own freaking, their tactics against them. At the end of the day, they really thought they could divide and conquer, and he did the same thing against them. Like, it's crazy.
He flipped the script. Like, he divided and conquered Europeans, essentially, is what he did.
Really, that's crazy to think about.
I think we definitely need like an episode on that one as well, because especially when you think about like how he manipulated the French, British, and Italians, especially it's really crazy.
That's facts.
Definitely need an episode on that one.
People don't give him his credit, man, and that's the thing. Why this is one of the reasons why we wanted to do this podcast. We all know about the Battle of Adwa. We all know it was an amazing victory. We all know we won, but do we know what really happened? Do we know what happened in depth? And when you know what happened in depth, you just really give more credit to your ancestors, to our ancestors, and say, wow, like, geez, they were really operating at a different level out back that time, right?
And the various circumstances that were surrounding what was happening in Ethiopia and the geopolitical scene in Africa at that time. Like, the fact that we were the only country who managed to do that in Africa, and this isn't to belittle the other efforts to fight off colonialism in Africa. This is not to say there was a lot of people who popped off against that, but what made Ethiopia manage to stay out was because they kept this, and it was so, like, it's not a coincidence how a lot of these countries in Africa have adopted the green yellow flag, the green yellow red flag based off of our flag. because it was it was an inspiration to to other Africans to the notions that nationalism and unity in terms of African unity and Black unity could really could fight off this. It's just the magnitude. It's so significant, and we really sometimes we kind of take for granted because we have all of this right now. But back then, these concepts were not almost non-existent back in the days, especially when these negative stereotypes of Africans being hostile to each other, and these barbaric fiefdoms who were constantly fighting each other. It didn't exist, so it just makes it all the more great, what our ancestors managed to accomplish, like you said, Elsh.
Yeah, absolutely, man. We cannot belittle it. We don't understand the gravity of what was able to be done at Adwa. And that's why exactly we did this podcast, because you need to know in depth what happened, man. And once you understand that, you can never look down on their accomplishments. Mind you, this is something we all contributed to. There's no Ethiopian, I think, that didn't have an ancestor or somebody related to them that went out there and fought, and many times didn't come home. So like, pay homage. Like, we will forever pay homage. People are always asking, like, "Oh, you guys are always so proud of Adwa." Like, okay, you didn't get colonized. What else? No, we are going to flex that
Facts.
to the day we die, and so will our children. So will their children. All right, because you heard it in the podcast. I mean, if you had history like that, would you not want to shout it from the rooftops? Like, come on, right? So, there's so many factors that led to an Ethiopian victory, but that ultimately I have to go with Sammy, man. That Ethiopian, that Ethiopianism, it's too embedded in our DNA. Like, you can't. I don't care if we're fighting amongst each other. Somebody comes into your home to enslave your people, you're going to fight that off. And you have to understand, Ethiopia has been surrounded by enemies and people that are hostile to our nation, that want to conquer us for centuries. That's just a fact. And we're going to go into other podcasts and episodes where we talk about the different types of wars, et cetera, that have afflicted our country. However, no foreign power has been able to dominate and subjugate us or occupy us and conquer us for extended periods of time. We have always been able to rally amongst ourselves, unite, fight to the end against all odds, and win and preserve that independence. That's key. I don't think there's going to be any generation of Ethiopians that is going to ever let that happen in our country. We see that today, and we're going to see that into the future. We're going to keep fighting. So what I'm saying is, we've been surrounded by enemies for so long. That makes us good at war. We don't like war. We don't invite hostilities, but if it comes to us, we will finish it. And Adwa is a good example, one of many examples of that.
One of many examples, exactly.
Yeah. And I think the Italians were ignorant to that fact, because they came in there saying, all right, we conquered this, we conquered that. All of Europe is conquering all these African countries. It's not that hard. We have superior weapons, more discipline, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Ethiopia is going to be the same, obviously, but they didn't check our track record. We have been doing this for a long time. We are good at fighting. It's so embedded in our nature and our culture too. Like, that warrior spirit is something we really, really aspire to be. Like, everybody wanted to be a warrior back then, because that's how you brought prestige and honor to your country. And dying on the battlefield was something to be proud of. You brought honor to your country, your household, et cetera, et cetera. So I think they severely, severely underestimated us, and they paid for it.
Definitely.
Nice. One last thing I wanted to mention was, like, that spirit of collaboration, the Ethiopian net and stuff, is key, but also, like, the food supply. So Ethiopians travel light, and they move quick, and that allows them to move quick. Of course, they fleece the land, they loot a lot, and loot and pillage from from the peasantry. But also, something that's really important to note is that people like Itege Taitu, and also Abuye Abdul Rahman, who was the chief of the Jale Oromo clan. They provided, like, thousands of cattle to feed the army, and that helped, like, keep them fed. And, like, of course, they got starved, like, for 1 month at Makale, but yeah, that definitely helped them a lot.
Yeah, without a doubt. Like there's so many, so much we can talk about. We're gonna run out of time if we do, but yeah, 100%. Like the logistics and the fact that you had to feed 100,000 warriors who had to find their own food was not easy. And so, without by all means, like we need to like. There's so many layers to this campaign that people don't understand the gravity of what it took to do what we did as Ethiopians that day. So I agree 100%, Nati.
That was very great, guys. And for the next topic, I wanted to know what is y'all's favorite story or part from the saga, or from whatever y'all have covered on this podcast so far about Adwa.
Who wants to go? Um,
You could start it off, Sam.
um, Honestly speaking, like I grew up hearing a lot of stories of what particular, certain Arbeñas did, a lot of, regional leaders did, a lot of, what their contributions to the war was, from what I heard, from my family growing up, things that you couldn't even like, you can't really read up on books unless you read like the real, like the Amharic, right? Like the Amharic stories and stuff. And I hear like, almost like myths, like you would grow up like you would sleep at night, you would listen to before you sleep at night, right? um and I remember just some of them from the top of my head. Like I would remember hearing the stories of how Empress Taitu, how she would come up. She mounted up in Adwa, and she brought a lot. She not only just she brought like I believe about 20,000 men, personal men from her personal region in Yeju and from Gondar to fight in the army. But she also brought a lot of women. So she brought a lot of women nurses, people who were going to feed the army back then, because she knew how strategically you were bringing a whole army, almost 100,000 people from different parts of the country into that small region up in the north where Adwa is. And a lot of it, they were very aware of the fact that resources were, they were burning out, and they would have to move, fast. So basically, she brought a lot of women. She brought a lot of people to bring in their cattle to feed the army while they waited until the battle was going to start. And even before Adwa, right before Adwa started, I remember hearing a story of how she brought in a lot of women. She disguised women, people from her clique, I guess you could say. She disguised them as peasants, to go into the Italian camp, and to kind of serve them, to pretend that they were going to surrender to them, basically. And a lot of the Italian soldiers, basically, they would often remark on how beautiful Ethiopian women were, etc., etc. But in reality, what these women did was what they would carry like a lot of these drugs, and they would go and they would poison their wells. They poison their wells, and they would make these ravines completely poisoned, to the point where when a lot of these Italian soldiers would drink from this river, and they would drink from this well, they were completely they were out of it. So they were, particularly because of this, it made the Italians, it was from this particular instance why it would have made the Italians hasty, and they went and they attacked earlier than it was suspected, because they wanted to kind of delay they wanted to bide their time until the Ethiopian army was going to completely just ravage the land and make exhaust the natural resources of that land. But because of this, they made them desperate, and then they had to go out and attack earlier than they would have wanted to. So this contribution of what Taitu did, and I'm not 100% sure whether it's totally based on reality. It could have been, exaggerated, for example. But this is something that I grew up learning about, and I've read about it from other, historians. But this is things like, this is just gold. Like the fact that she would go, and she would the fact that women, like, they were a really influential part of Adwa. The fact that they both were warriors, and they would also, they helped feed the starving. They helped feed the army. They helped nurse their injuries after the Adwa the aftermath of the battle. This particular story really stood out to me. But I would hear other stories. Balcha Abba Nefso, what he did with the cannon in the Battle of Adwa. There was these stories, but just from the top of my head right now, that's that one that kind of stands out to me personally, because it's something that I feel like has sometimes been overlooked, both by foreigners and by Ethiopians alike. So I thought that was something interesting. I thought that was really interesting for me. But there's so many contributions that so many people did in Adwa that sometimes don't get the recognition, they don't get the attention that they really deserve. But I'm sure you guys have your own kind of opinions and stories that kind of speak out to you.
Yeah, Sammy, I couldn't agree more, man. That was profound, man. Like there are, we hear about Ras Alula, we hear about Emperor Menelik, we hear about, all these amazing heroes at the Battle of Adwa and the things that they did, and just Balcha Safo, and you hear about the Ras Mangeshas and the Nugus Takla Haimanots, but how many stories go untold? How many stories are unheard? You know what I mean? Like, it's unbelievable to me when we think about how many warriors and how many people contributed so many brave acts of heroism on the battlefield, but also off the battlefield. And when you talk about the contribution of women in the Adwa campaign, man, you guys don't understand. Like, do you know how hard it is to cook for an army of 100,000 men? Like,
I can
you
imagine.
don't understand the gravity of that situation. Like, Sammy, you hit it on the head. Emperor Taitu was so far thinking. And I'm not trying to be in any way, downplay the contributions of women or whatever, because they did fight on the battlefield too. Don't forget that they did. But women were cooking for the men or for the army during that time, during that campaign. So you have to understand, like, cooking and setting up and prepping and making injera for 100,000 soldiers is not easy, and not to even mention this, it took a toll on the peasantry as well, because the Ethiopian army foraged. They didn't have supply lines like the Italians. They fought a completely different type of warfare. But for me personally, when I talk about Adwa, like, what are my favorite moments of Adwa, or the whole story of Adwa and the campaign to Adwa? I mean, to me, it was, my favorite part is every time Ethiopians would check European ignorance and superiority. Like, that was so funny to me. Like, one of my favorite scenes in Adwa was when, the British diplomat Gerald Portal, goes to patch things up between Ras Alula, and like, just the flex that Ras Alula had. If you guys go back to the first episode and you hear how Ras Alula is described and how, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, after he wipes out 500 Italians at Dogali, the ones that invaded his land and are occupying Ethiopian territory at this time, and he tells Ras Alula, like, hey, Italy wants compensation as land for you fighting and defeating their soldiers. And he looks at him and he's like, listen, the Italians should only come to Ethiopia if I, Ras Alula, can go become governor of Rome. And that was like my favorite quote, because, like, what are you thinking? What do you mean? You want to come to my land? You're not from here. You want us to give you our land for you to rule and govern and enslave our people? All right, you know what? You can do that if I can go to Rome and do the same thing. How's that? And I like, like, to me, that was just so funny when they check these little the European arrogance towards Africans in general. And I thought that was like, that to me, that was one of the funniest moments. Like, and you just tell, like, Ethiopians just had a sense of humor. That's just classic Ethiopian sense of humor. So sarcastic, like, you want to come here and rule Sahati and Asmara and all that? Okay, great. Well, I want to go rule Rome, so let's make a trade, And that was just so funny to me. And there's so many other moments like that, even when Hagos, the Shifta, like Hagos Tafari, I believe, or no, was it Hagos Tafari? No, it was Bahata Hagos. Bahata Hagos, when he goes to dinner to one of the Italian generals or one of the Italian commanders' house, And then at the end of the dinner, he ends up like turning on him and tying him up and saying, you know, like, we're taking over. We're not taking commands from you anymore. And the guy looks at him and he says, go ahead, but Italy is great. And then he shoots back at him. Yeah, but Ethiopia is greater still, you know, like that was such like, these are hard moments where they just check European ignorance. Like, oh my God, like it just, you know, and even when they took Italian prisoners at the end of the Adwa campaign, it was just so funny to me that the Italians were in a completely new world where, wow, we're not actually superior to blacks. We're in a situation where we're at their mercy, you know, and it just manifested itself in little things where the Ethiopians would eat first, or they would drink water first, and then they would let their animals drink, and then, you know, the Italians would drink last, you know. So little things like that would just make me laugh, you know, and it just showed me that Ethiopians, you know, we really do check that ignorance, that white supremacy. And the Battle of Adwa was a classic example of that. And I think we still have that independent nature. Of course, we definitely do, but we don't bow our heads to anyone. Like, I think our ancestors said it best, you know, "Angatachin lamannim annasayim," and we don't bow our heads to anyone. And that was just such a good example of it. So there's so many moments like that were so cinematic and that should be in a movie. I know I said this all the time, but yeah, those were a couple of my favorites. But yes, the Battle of Adwa, my favorite moments were every time the Europeans thought, or the Italians thought, yeah, we got the Ethiopians, you know, we got them on the ropes. We're gonna win. This is cut and dry. It's gonna be an easy campaign. Blah say blah. You know, they're primitive. They're savages. All this stuff. And then the Ethiopians end up saying, nah, actually, you know what? That's not going to happen. We're going to check you and we're going to win. And it just shatters their hopes and beliefs and their ideals. And I love that. And that wasn't just an example for the Italians. That was an example for the whole world, who felt like, you know, Europeans or whites were superior to people of color. And Ethiopia shattered that belief, like completely shattered it. It was a situation where blacks defeated whites. And in that racial dimension, it was very, very significant to give hope to so many other people around the world. But yeah, that's what was my favorite thing. Nati, what do you think, bro?
Actually, I just wanted to remark. Sorry, Nati, I didn't want to. I'm gonna let you go, but I just kind of, when you were talking about Ethiopians responding to ignorance, European ignorance and white people's ignorance, it reminds me of a story about 30 years later that was happening. I don't know if y'all heard with the story, but basically there was a prince by the name of Ras Hailu, and he was sent by Haile Selassie as an ambassador basically to Italy, basically, and he sent him. I think it was Italy, or is it Britain? No, it was Britain.
England.
Yeah, and he sent him to to the ambassador, to the ministers of England, and they were basically asking him. They were like, "Do you understand French?" He was like, "No." "Do you understand Italian?" "No." "Do you understand Spanish?" He's like, "No." And he was like, "Well, you must be, you know, educated in ignorance." And he was like, "Oh, okay, bet." I was like, "Do you understand Orominya?" "No." "Do you understand Amarinya?" "No." "Do you understand Guraginya?" "No." "Well, look at you being ignorant as hell." Like, it's the fact that they really just, they're so witty in their responses. Like, they're so well aware of their ignorance and their racism, but it's like they be using their own logic against them. I just wanted to, it just popped into my mind when you were talking about that. I was like, it just reminded me in that scenario that made me laugh. But yeah, you go ahead, Natty. I don't want to interject, but it just kind of made me laugh.
No.
Sorry, quick one too. There was a story where they went to the Ethiopian delegation went to Hamburg in Germany, and the Germans were showing them their guns too, and they were looking at them like, "Oh, we're gonna impress these savages with our modern weapons." And the Ethiopians end up taking those guns from them and like knew how to operate them, how to reload them, how to shoot them perfectly. And the Germans were looking at them like, "What the hell? How do you guys know how to use our guns so well?" And they looked at them and said, "Your guns are outdated. We have better guns than you back home." And it just shows you like you're right, that wittiness is just so funny, man. Like I love Ethiopian humor, man. It's just great.
It's amazing.
Yeah, my bad, Natty. Go ahead, bro.
Yeah, facts. That was a funny story, especially you know, it was between Ras Hailu, Taklamount of Godjam, and King George V. So this was a conversation between.
I don't remember who it was between. I know it's Ras Hailu, but I thought it was just a British minister. Honestly, I didn't know.
Yeah, it was dead as the king when
Wow.
when Haile Selassie was still what's it called, Crown Prince when they went on their tour of Europe with a
Yeah.
lot of different names. Yeah, so yeah, that story always makes me it cracks me up a lot. Um, but yeah, my favorite part of what's it called, the Battle of Adwa would have to be, there's a lot. If it's not the one that I discussed earlier in the episodes about Fitorari Gabeyo, if it's not about him, it would have to be Itegetai to ripping up the treaty. And, when she ripped it up and like her response to her brother's suggestion to submit to Italy, she was like, okay, you should wear this dress and I'll wear your pants. That one's, yeah, that's like,
That was iconic.
exactly. Yeah. There's just a bunch of, like you guys said, there's just a lot of different stuff, like different amazing quotes and sacrifices. They're so amazing in this throughout the entire thing.
No, without a doubt, man. Ethiopians are just so funny, man. Like even when the Italian prisoners were going back to Italy, when Italy paid for them, all those millions of dollars to Menelik for that ransom, quote. Well, it wasn't a ransom. It was an exchange, but it ideally was a ransom. But anyways, when they were going back home, their captors, remember that one Oromo, his name was Burru, the one in Harar that was like had I think one of the generals under his command at that time and. He would piss him off all the time because like, yeah, we defeated you guys, et cetera, et cetera. But when they're leaving, they gave them a long list, the prisoners that they had under their command, a long list of things to send them from Italy that they needed. They were like, all right, we want shoes, we want dresses, we want this, we want more guns, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, it just blew my mind. Like you guys had them as prisoners for damn near 3-4 months. And now you guys are sending them requests to bring them to send you stuff from Italy. Like it's just hilarious to me. Yeah. And Ethiopian humor is just undefeated, man. Undefeated.
Something I've always heard growing up, I don't have any idea about any specific battles, but I've always heard that women would use berbere and they would use that to blind Italian men. So I don't know if that's true, but that's something I always heard about. I thought that was clever. So do y'all have any confirmation on that?
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't. I heard about this as a kid, but I don't know if it was to be taken literally.
No.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think it was. Yeah, like during the Italian occupation, the Arbenyas, the female Arbenyas particularly, some of them, went to extreme like extent. They would sleep with the soldiers and like slaughter them afterwards. But like I've also heard that they would put berberes in their eyes or something like to sort of torture. Like I've also heard this thing. Yeah, so it's but I don't know. I don't like have any paper sources, to be honest.
I mean, I do remember hearing about when during the Italian occupation during that second fascist war. I do remember hearing about stories of back in the highlands, when the Italians were marching down, and Ethiopian women would like be cooking wet with a lot of zait in particular, and they would it would be burning hot, and they would pour it on them. They would pour it down on top of their houses. So that's something that I do remember hearing about. That shit burns. Like that stuff burns the house. So I do remember hearing stuff like that. And they probably added meat or in there maybe. But in terms of that, I do remember hearing something like that. But in eyes, like that's that I mean that I'm not gonna say that probably hurt like hell. So.
You know why I believe it, or I'm inclined to believe that was true, is because look, personal story. My grandmother, or she's from Showa. She's from Mans, and growing up, she had a rule, and that rule went through generations. All right, from my mom to me to her, and it was if you get into a fight, don't come home crying. Okay, I don't want to see you cry. You go back out there and you keep fighting. All right, cool. So that being said, my aunt was when growing up in Addis Ababa, my grandmother would tell her, look, if you can't, because she would fight boys, and sometimes she would get beat up. She was really strong back then. She's like, look, if you get beat up, if the boy's too big or too strong, you keep berbere on you and you throw it in his eyes. And we all know Showa, especially, when you come from that Menze background, like they are known for being very patriotic and whatnot. I'm pretty sure that's something that was carried on from generation to generation. Like, if my aunt was doing that, at her young age, it just shows me that, it's pretty not far-fetched that Ethiopian women were doing that at the Battle of Adwa too. So
Yep.
that's just my little anecdote, my little story. But yeah, I think that would have been very likely.
Nah, for sure. That kills me actually.
Nah,
Plus,
thanks for confirming that. That story came from your ancestors. Literally
I
came from your
came.
great grandmother or something.
That was for real. That was us. We did that. So I think it's true.
Why do you think Atsir Menelik didn't push the Italians out of the Horn of Africa?
so that question I think can be divided like into two. I think a lot of people ask this question, especially because first, there are two things. Did Minlik intend to push them out of the Horn of Africa? And then second is, why didn't he do that? So for the first question, there's a lot of sources that indicate that Minlik did want to. For instance, I think I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, from Raymond Jonas's book. I think page 130, 137, around there. Ato Gurgioros, one of Ras Makonan's lieutenants, was actually sent into the Italian, the Italians had held Mekelle at that point and were fortified inside it. So he accompanied an Italian doctor back into the fort and was given like a feast in his honor. So he got drunk and he explained that Minlik intended to enjoy a drink in the Italian governor's palace at Massawa, which indicates that Minlik did intend to go that far. Plus, I believe that Minlik's own secretary, meaning Safi Tizaz, meaning Lord of the Pen, Gabra Selassie, mentioned that Minlik's intention was to push the Italians completely out of Africa. I think you can find that in Reflections on the Battle of Adwa by Paulus Milkias. So, yeah, I think that, there are a lot of factors that led to Minlik not doing that. One was the fact that he spent 1 month outside the gates of Mekelle, just siege, holding a siege over the Italians who fortified themselves in there. And Ethiopians were not used to that in any way whatsoever. So that exhausted their food supplies, the little ones that they did have. That also turned like the local population hostile because Ethiopian soldiers had to take food from them. Plus, it really just increased tensions in the area. So that 1 month outside of Mekelle really cost them a lot. So they didn't really even have the resources to push on from Adwa to Massawa because the terrain in Eritrea is very, very dry. So foraging in those areas is extremely difficult. So that's one of the reasons I don't think, and that's one of the main reasons that people cite, especially when discussing this. The other is, of course, some cite that Minlik was pretty shrewd and wanted to sort of separate or reduce maybe Ras Mangasha's sphere of influence. That's what a lot of people also try to say. But it could have been a combination of those two, or it could have been what I think, which is mainly food and terrain. Yeah.
Mm. Mm.
I
No,
oh yeah,
you Yeah, no, I agree. I 100% agree. Particularly when it comes to the shortage of supplies, like they didn't have supply lines. They don't. Ethiopians at that time didn't fight conventional warfare, quote unquote. They were not orthodox in their military strategy in the sense that they had supply lines that would feed their army. Their army literally had to fend for itself. So, you know those little lunch boxes that we have back home. What do you call them? You know what I'm talking. Yeah,
Yeah.
Magal. There you go. Yeah, that's literally you would pack what you can. Your family would come with you. Your wife, your kids would accompany you to war, and you packed what you could for the war. But if you ran out of food, it was kind of like, yo, figure it out. You got to forage. You have to get it from the local population. You have to like literally pillage the peasants, and it took a toll. That's also gave Menelik an advantage in the sense that his army was more mobile, more agile than the Italians. But mind you, if you run out of food and your army can't eat, then your army is going to wither away. That's why like moving quickly was a matter of survival for Menelik's army. And cutting off the Italian supply line was brilliant because the Italians could not operate that way. They didn't fight war that way. But outside of that, one major thing that people don't understand is Ethiopia went through a major drought at that time, and it was historically considered one of the worst droughts, if not the worst drought in our history. To this day, they used to call it Kufukan, which means the evil days, and that's how people reference any drought or compare any drought to this day to those days. They would say Kufukan, like right, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to understand when they went through that drought at that time in that campaign, part of the reason for that drought happening was the Italians were importing cattle from abroad to feed their soldiers. And those cattle that they were bringing in from India brought in rinderpest, which is a disease that affects cattle. And that's a disease that Ethiopian cattle had not been exposed to. And that ended up killing the local cattle in Ethiopia and wiping them out and killing off our food supply. So we're going through a drought. How in the world are you going to now take your army and into an entire colony that was established already by the Italians for X amount of years, and now try to liberate that colony? That makes no sense. Now, Menelik knew he secured Ethiopia's borders, and yes, the land that was occupied or turned into a colony of Eritrea by the Italians was Ras Mangasha's. That was his territory. However, Eritrea had been established as a colony for many, many years. And you have to understand when Menelik was doing the expansion process to expand, defeat his rivals, and unify Ethiopia. That happened in the 1877s. So for almost 10 years, that campaign to solidify his control, import arms, et cetera, it took years to do that. And in that time, the Italians were not just sitting there folding their hands and watching what was happening. They were fighting against Ras Mangasha. They were consolidating their power, and they had turned Eritrea into a colony. And now they had an established colony where they had full military, economic, et cetera, control. And now, once the Battle of Adwa happened, already established. So what I'm trying to say is that now for Menelik to defeat the Italians at Adwa and now go into Eritrea meant that he was now going to the belly of the beast, essentially.
They had an uphill battle.
Exactly. You have an established colony with Italian soldiers that are coming in every single day from Italy to Massawa, that are reinforced by Eritrean Askari. Keep that in mind. They had almost 50% of their military was Eritrean Askari. They were fortified. They were ready. Why would Menelik now take 100,000 troops that had just sacrificed themselves to secure what is Ethiopia's borders into the colony of Eritrea to fight more in a hostile region where there's more Eritrean Askari, there's more Italian colonial soldiers that are reinforced, that are fresh, that are ready to fight and sacrifice his troops? It makes no sense. And mind you, doing that within a time where Ethiopia is going through a drought because of the rinderpest. That makes no sense to me. As a leader, he said, all right, we won. They recognize the sovereign independence of Ethiopia. Here are our borders. I cannot justify this. I cannot go into this colony of Eritrea where they are hostile to me. They are fighting against me. The local population is against us. We cannot do that. I'm not going to sacrifice our territorial gain and our recognition to liberate an Italian colony. It makes no sense. And to me, I understand his decision. And as a leader, you have to make hard decisions. And that's, in my opinion, that is the reason why Menelik did not pursue his victories or basically follow up his victories in Ethiopia into Eritrea and liberate the rest of Eritrea. What do you think, Sam?
No, honestly, like you and Nati, you guys have explained it really well. This has probably been one of the, one of the biggest like mysteries in terms of the debates on whether Menelik should have, went initiative. He should have pursued them to completely eradicate them from the Horn. Why didn't he pursue them? What was his, his attitude, and why he never really addressed it? So this is something that has been, the subject of debate to many historians, to many academics. But like both of you have already pointed out, there are a multitude of different factors, both political, economic, strategic. There was just so many things that was going on, and both of you have really covered it well. And like people don't understand, I feel like that. In terms of the economic point of stand view, like I mentioned it before, all of us have mentioned it before, that there was this army that the Menelik, he amassed it from a whole bunch of different regions, and they were abundant. Like there were so many, to the point there was almost 100,000 people, and that was back then. That was a lot of people back then. When the population of Ethiopia, that was almost like, you could say like almost maybe 5% of the entire population was in that one district of Ethiopia as a whole. So it comes to a point where, they were already facing, plights. They were facing diseases. And some people don't understand, might not know, is that previously, a couple of years ago, Ethiopia faced a really, really bad drought. They faced a really bad drought. They faced a very bad famine that killed a lot of cattle. And the fact that sometimes people don't know is that 90% of Ethiopia, the cattle and the livestock, was completely wiped out by rinderpest. So they were already, where they're running out of supplies. The Ethiopian army was running out of supplies. It was running out of, food to sustain itself, because that specific target land was, it was unable. That land could not sustain such an amass amount of people and soldiers who were constantly eating, and they needed these resources in order to regain their strength. So practically speaking, they drove the Italians out of Ethiopia. They drove the Italians out of Ethiopia, the Battle of Adwa. So it comes to a point where it's like, now the question is whether they need to dislodge them as a whole. They need to go into the Italian occupied area of what you would consider Eritrea and Asmara and Massawa, and these areas. And as you said, Elsh, they were the situation there is different than it was there, because they had spent 10 years, almost 10-15 years, amassing arms, amassing, strengthening their bases, the local bases within these occupied areas that were occupied much prior to Menelik becoming emperor. So by the time that Menelik became emperor, these were already firmly under the Italian control. So there was a risk that if Menelik's forces, who were they were victorious, but they were still very tired, there was that risk that if they went into these areas that were very strengthened, it was going to give them time. The Italians could have, gotten more soldiers. They could have gotten more soldiers to help out, to help out these bases. And if the Menelik took these, these weakened soldiers, a lot of them died, a lot of them wounded, and they lost. That would have been disastrous for Ethiopia. They would have caused complete momentum at the end of the day, and they would have destroyed. They would have lost everything that they had fought so hard for. And there are these factors that as a leader of a sovereign nation, sometimes you, just like you said, that you have to make tough choices. You have to make the tough political choices. And from a practical point of view, there was these factors that were very significant in altering his view. And it wasn't just that. There was there were a lot of native Eritrean nobles who were in his court, like Ato Gebre Exeaber and Basha Aulum, who advised him not to pursue the Italians. They were aware of the Italian strength in these bases, that they said that if you come here, it's a really big risk, and you might as well not risk, coming here, because you're going to lose everything you fought so hard for. So these were advisors. These were native Eritrean, Tigrinya speaking advisors who advised him not to do so. So, there were these contributing factors that a lot of people don't really know. So, the events, the circumstances that, that were preceding even before Minilik's ascension to power really Minilik was facing an uphill battle, as soon as he became emperor. There were things that were completely out of his hands that he couldn't prevent, and I think he pretty much figured that he consolidated his loss and his situation right now, in terms of what was best suited for Ethiopia as a country, and to prevent any sort of risk of losing all hopes, all gains that they worked so hard for, to maintain their sovereignty, because they could have lost it all of these soldiers, 100,000 soldiers they got from the entire country. Had they lost, they went into these areas, and had they lost, were they defeated, it would have left the country completely wide open to attack. It would have just been completely disastrous. So, but at this point, it's just one of those things where we leave it to speculation often, but also we have to regard these different factors, these socio-political factors, the economic factors, in terms of that. But you guys have already pretty much reflected, you've already pointed them out flawlessly. So just to add to that, it's something that we can speculate on, but in the long run, it set our borders today. What you would see in present day the Ethiopian borders today, and we managed to maintain our sovereignty because of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's absolutely right, Sammy. Yeah, and that's not to belittle in any way what Menelik was able to achieve, but he was also very realistic, and you're not going to bite off more than you can chew at this point, right? Going into pursuing the Italians into Eritrea and trying to take them out of a colony, like you said, that had been established for 10 plus years. That's not going to be easy at all, and it would have led to potentially an Ethiopian defeat, and he would have left the country wide open, like you said. So I agree 100%. It did hinder Ethiopia in the sense that Ethiopia did not have access to our own ports. Yeah. And we had to look elsewhere for ports in order to import or export what we had in our country. So that was something that was definitely, in my opinion, it was not a mistake, because we talked about the factors as to why Menelik did not pursue the Italians into Eritrea and liberate all of Eritrea. However, it did have two very significant circumstances. One being you had the Italians that were firmly established in Eritrea and were to conquer it for the next 70 years, and that would completely sever the two populations or two peoples for almost 2 or 3 generations, where now they are going to be hostile towards Ethiopia, because the colonists were hostile towards Ethiopia. And that was going to leave a deep wedge between the Ethiopian people and the Eritrean people. Furthermore, the Italians could use and did use Eritrea as a launching pad to invade Ethiopia for a second time, which we're going to go into more detail on another episode. But in 1935, Mussolini used Eritrea and his other colonies in Somalia to penetrate and invade Ethiopia for a second time. So it left Ethiopia vulnerable in 2 ways. There was always that threat that the Italians could invade Ethiopia again using Eritrea. Yeah. And we were completely surrounded and landlocked, and we had to look elsewhere for our port access. And so they had those strategic advantages over Ethiopia in the long run. But Menelik could not pursue them further, because it would have been, in my opinion, a mistake. It would have decimated the Ethiopian army. Yes, we were strong. Yes, we were solid. But like Sammy said, our troops were accumulated from all corners of Ethiopia. They were far away from home. They were tired. They fought at Ambalege. They fought at Mekele. They fought at Adwa. These are not easy battles. And you expect them now to go into an Italian colony where fresh troops were coming in from Misawa every day? Come on, man.
Yeah, you never know. There was talks that they were going to turn on Minilik because they were exhausted. This was something that was in the past. If you pushed your soldiers too much and they're unmotivated, they might turn on you, and they're going to just completely give up, and that would have been even more disastrous.
Exactly. So, Baratieri made a bad decision attacking Menelik instead of retreating. Menelik was a shrewd military strategist, but he's also a realist. He's like, I'm not going to make the same mistakes as these guys. All right, cool. This is what's happened. But also, here's the situation. Here's the reality of the situation. We're in a drought. My soldiers are tired. They're hungry. They're far away from home. Eritrea is an established Italian colony. They have fresh troops coming in every day from Italy into Massawa. They are reinforced. They have supply lines in Eritrea. This doesn't make any sense.
Right.
We can't go in there. We can't. And honestly, if I were Menelik, I would do the same thing. Again, this is something that we can always speculate and forever debate. However, here are the facts of the situation at that time, and the rest is up for interpretation for all of you. But This is just our understanding of the situation based on the facts on the ground at that time. That's all.
Exactly. Well, I think we've convened. I think we've talked on some pretty hard-hitting discussion points. Adwa, it means so much to all of us. And the events that led up to the war, the events during the war, and what happened after. All of these was they were all significant in their own respective ways on what shaped the future events, the future political events of Ethiopia, and even to other African nations in the Black diaspora. These were all very significant in every to each of us. So that's why I think it's important to have like these historical discussions and to speak about this, because a lot of like you said, Elsh, a lot of us know about Adwa, but do we really know about it? Do we really know like the details and the hidden cracks in terms of some of the mysteries that we might have, the questions that we might have? Even I think talking about it, really we can unearth a lot of a knowledge that a lot of us might not know of. There's things that I learned today that I didn't hear about myself, even though I'm well versed about I would say I'm well versed on the historical the events of Adwa, but there are things we've talked about that I had no idea, I never heard. So it was really great for me to hear. I think it was very helpful for me to hear both of your inputs and your perspectives on this history, and things that I never learned. So thank y'all, both of you guys, to you and Nati.
My pleasure, man. And I feel the same exact way, man. I learned so much that I didn't know before, and that's what we did this podcast for, man. That's the beauty of it, man. We're here to share knowledge based on viable facts and historical facts, and this is what we're here for, man. So it's my pleasure, and thank you, Sammy.
Nah, for sure. So yeah, stay tuned, guys. Thank you guys for listening.
Thanks, guys.
We're going to be doing a thank you every episode in a different Ethiopian language. For this episode, we will use Tigrinya. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please be sure to follow us on social media at Tarik Podcast on all major platforms.